All right, so we're looking at chapter 1 of Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. And just as a reminder, Surprised by Hope is divided up into 3 separate parts or sections. Part 1 is designed to lay the groundwork for the 2 basic questions at the heart of the book. What is the ultimate hope for Christians? In other words, what happens after we die? And what does that have to do with here and now? What hope is there for any kind of change in the present? So these 2 questions are addressed in parts 2 and 3, and then part 1 lays the foundation for those 2 questions. So if part 1 isn't what you hoped the book would be, keep going. I think most people come to this book to learn about heaven, hell, judgment, resurrection, but those questions don't get addressed until part 2. So in chapter 1, Wright aims to show how much confusion there is in the wider non-Christian world around what happens after we die. This isn't to say the church has it right. He thinks the church is confused too, but he addresses the church in chapter 2. In chapter 1, he's just dealing with the wider non-Christian world. And I actually think the introduction may be even more helpful than the heart of the chapter, so I'm going to spend a little more time on the introduction than I otherwise would have. So in the introduction, Wright gives us 5 snapshots that really beg the 2 questions at the heart of the book. What is our future hope, and what difference does it make here and now? I'm only going to cover 2 of the snapshots because they're really straightforward, and if you realize that the point of the snapshots is to intensify these 2 questions at the heart of the book, then you won't have any trouble working your way through these 5 snapshots. So the first one is the death of Princess Diana. And Wright points out that people responded to her death in a wide variety of ways. And this shows the confusion around what happens after we die. And then, of course, it begs the question, what is life after death? And then jumping down to the 5th snapshot, Wright paints a picture of a small post-industrial coal mining town in Durham, England. This is a community enduring the pain and sadness of being forgotten by a world that has moved on. And Wright asks, what hope is there for these kinds of communities? And of course, this begs the second core question of the book, which is how does our future hope impact our present world? So it's right after these 5 snapshots that I think the introduction gets really interesting. And Wright just briefly turns his attention to the question, what does our future hope have to do with our current situation, our current pain and suffering? And he's not going to give the answer here. It's too early in the book for that. But he is going to say something incredibly important, and it can take a minute to get your head around it. He says, our future hope and our present reality have often been treated as if they have nothing to do with one another, as if they're completely separate. And then he says, as long as we think about our future hope as escaping this world and going to heaven, upward in the sky somehow, then you're going to think our future hope and our present reality have nothing to do with one another. In other words, why be concerned with the present world if we're just going to leave it behind one day? But if you think about our future hope as the New Testament does, as the rescue and renewal and transformation of this present world. In other words, if you understand that our future hope is this world recreated so that we really do see earth as it is in heaven, then it makes a lot of sense to see our future hope and our present reality as deeply connected. If that doesn't click for you, maybe pause the video and think about it for a minute, or run it back and listen again. And if it's still fuzzy after that, don't worry, because he hasn't really explained it yet, and he will later in the book. And then, as an aside to the actual content of the chapter, I want to point something out. This paragraph contains 2 themes that show up again and again in Wright's books, his lectures, his conferences, his interviews, his YouTube videos. If you pay any attention to Wright for any length of time, you'll know that there are certain things that Wright really wants the church to understand, and he repeats them over and over again. And the first theme is this: our ultimate future hope is not that we will escape this world for heaven. This idea that we will leave this world behind and spend eternity somewhere upward is nearly ubiquitous in Christianity. especially in the West where I live. And Wright wants to correct this view. The second theme in this paragraph that we see over and over again in Wright's content is that eternal life will unfold in this world, newly created, on a new, transformed, healed version of this world. And he finishes out the introduction by just saying again, even Christians are really confused about life after death. And this shows up in our praying, our songs, our liturgy, our practice, and even our mission. And if Christians are confused about what we believe, then of course the non-Christian world is going to be confused about what we believe. And everyone goes around thinking Christians just believe in some kind of generic life after death, but no one really knows the specifics around judgment, the resurrection, the return of Jesus, these topics. And so Wright's going to say there's so much more at stake here than just thinking right thoughts about life after death. What's really at stake is God's purpose for our world and understanding what God is doing in our world right here and now. At this point, Wright jumps into the heart of the chapter. And again, his aim in this chapter is to show the confusion in the wider non-Christian world about life after death. And he really jumps around and gives a hodgepodge of examples. The first thing he does is point out that the major world religions have really different ideas about life after death. And he gives brief examples from Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. And then he also notes, even within these great religions, there's actually a lot of variety. And then he says there's also a good bit of variation around what the non-Christian world believes the dead are up to right now. What are they doing right now? And he gives the example of ancestor worship in parts of East Asia and Africa, which entails the belief that ancestors continue to be present and influence the lives of the living even here and now. Then he jumps to the confusion in his own country, and he says, and I quote, "I suspect there was never a period when Christian orthodoxy on this subject was the belief of even the majority of people in Britain." And again, he just gives a hodgepodge of examples. So now he jumps over to the changing attitudes about hell after World War I. He says there had been so much hell on earth, people really had a hard time believing there could be another hell after we die. And then between World War I and World War II, there had been so much death, people couldn't cope with it. And so in his own childhood experience in the 50s, no one even talked about death. And then he contrasts that to today, where death is present in all different forms of art and entertainment. And then he says, where does that leave us? What can we actually say about what people believe about life after death? Wright says belief about life after death falls into 3 categories. And I should add, this is not meant to be exhaustive. He knows he's just barely skimming the surface here. The first category is simply annihilation. And this is where we just cease to exist. The second category is reincarnation. And this is the idea that after we die, we begin a new life in some other body or form. And he points out it's not just Hindus who believe in reincarnation. And then this next bit he lumps in with category 2, but I actually think it could be a third category. He says that many people believe when we die, we become one with the world. It's this idea that we're absorbed into the sun, the moon, the rain, the stars. He calls this New Age idea, and I quote, a sort of low-grade, popular nature religion with elements of Buddhism. And I guess it's possible that is the third category, but I think the third category is this belief in ghosts and contact with the dead. He makes a point to say this belief that we can communicate with the dead or belief in ghosts has persisted despite all the ground that secularism has gained. And then he does make the point that none of these 3 popular categories are aligned with New Testament ideas around life after death. With that, we're done with chapter 1, and click the next video to go to chapter 2.